Hello, I'm Christy Sullivan. I work in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University. Thank you for joining me for my presentation, Healthy Forests, Healthy Deer. Today I'm going to discuss the impacts deer can have on our forests and how those impacts can affect the quality of deer habitat as well as habitat for other wildlife species and the future health of our forests overall. There are a number of different factors that can be used to determine whether or not a forest is healthy. But two key characteristics are whether a variety of native plant and tree species is able to grow there, and also whether or not a new forest is able to grow or regenerate in the case of a disturbance, either a natural disturbance like a windstorm or an ice storm, or if there's mortality of the tree canopy due to an invasive insect species, for example, or also in the case of a timber harvest where the canopy may be intentionally removed. A couple of studies have been conducted in the past several years looking at whether or not regeneration is occurring across New York State. How well are we doing? The first study is a study by the Nature Conservancy that was published in 2010. And the map in this slide shows basically what their findings were. In terms of native tree species, across about 68% of the state, we're seeing good to very good regeneration. In about a third of the state, however, there's poor to fair regeneration. When you look at the map, the green shows good or very good regeneration. So you can see the Adirondacks, for example, and a lot of the southern tier, we're getting pretty good regeneration. But the Catskills and the Hudson Valley native tree species are not regrowing when the canopy is opened up. When they looked further at those tree species that are desirable timber species, things like sugar maple and our oaks, which also, by the way, are very valuable species for producing wildlife food, they found that only about 43% of the state is seeing good to very good regeneration when we include looking at those species. More than half of the state, however, is seeing only poor to fair regeneration of those desirable timber species. A study that Cornell University conducted in 2009, where they surveyed foresters from across the state and asked them in terms of the percent of forest stands that they'd visited, how well were we doing in terms of regeneration? And they ranked the regeneration as being highly successful, moderately successful, marginally successful, or a complete failure. When you look at the statewide column across the state, they said about 13% of the stands were highly successful in terms of being able to regenerate or regrow new seedlings. 17% of the state was only seeing moderately successful regeneration, and marginally successful or stands with a complete failure added up to 70% of the stands. So essentially, in 70% of the forest stands that foresters have visited, they felt that regeneration was not happening adequately. When they were asked the reasons they perceived that marginal or failed forest regeneration was happening, the number one reason they reported was browsing by deer. Interfering vegetation was the second factor. So interfering vegetation is when you have vegetation that's either an invasive species or even a native species that's growing so densely across an area that it's preventing other seedlings from becoming established of other species. And this happens a lot with, for example, American beech or hop hornbeam is another species that could cause this. White-tailed deer are considered a keystone species because they have the ability to change their own habitat as well as the habitat of other species. And they do this by browsing on tree seedlings and other plants in a forest situation. Because they prefer to browse on some species over others, some are more palatable, they actually can change the composition of the species that are growing there as well as the structure of the forest. So here's an example of a slide illustrating how deer can change the forest structure. When you look at this picture of the forest, you can see that there's some sunlight getting through the forest canopy, so you would expect to see some seedlings, having enough sun to be able to grow and regenerate in the forest understory. But in this slide, because of in this area, because of heavy browsing by deer, there are actually missing layers of vegetation. So there's barely anything growing on the forest floor. There's nothing growing in the shrub layer or the understory, and you really just have one layer, the canopy of the forest, that's there. If something were to happen and you lose that tree canopy, there would be no young seedlings to grow and replace that existing forest. This slide shows an area where there was a timber harvest across the entire site. The only difference between the left side of the slide and the right side of the slide is that deer were excluded from the right side of the slide. So you can see that where deer have been excluded, there are a lot of young seedlings growing up in the shrub layer, lots of healthy regeneration happening. When you look at the area where deer were still present, you can see that there's basically no shrub layer or understory layer. It's just kind of a sea of ferns covering the forest floor. And you can see what's referred to as a browse line. So if you look at about a level of 5 to 6 feet, which is as high as deer can reach to feed on leaves and twigs and growing seedlings, you can see that there's basically no vegetation below that level. And so that's a real good sign to look for when you're trying to assess the impacts deer are having on your forest, whether that browse line is present and whether there's any vegetation growing under the level of 5 to 6 feet. Deer often browse species that they prefer. For example, the red oak is pictured here in the left, and by browsing on these species, they can eliminate that species from a forest, and other species get a competitive advantage and can kind of take over and form monocultures or single species that are growing in the forest. Some seedlings can hang on for many years. The seedling pictured in the left here, this red oak seedling, is about 6 or 7 years old, and it's been repeatedly browsed. It's still hanging on and it's still alive, but the form of that tree has been changed forever. It will never be a nice, tall, straight tree, and it's kind of just stuck on the forest floor, just kind of stuck there, hanging on. So I mentioned also that deer can affect the forest by influencing the kinds of plants that grow in the forest. And so here's a chart showing some species on the left that deer highly prefer to feed on, and some on the right that deer don't prefer to feed on so much. So red maple stump sprouts, for example, deer really like to feed on. Sugar maple, white ash is a preferred species, aspen, a lot of our oaks, and other species that are listed there. Some of our native shrubs, some of the elderberries and hobblebush, for example. Some of those species you don't see very much in forest at all, where the browsing by deer is very heavy. So those species tend to be the first ones that will be missing in a forest when you have heavy browsing by deer. And some of the low preference species, things they don't prefer to feed on as much, like American beech, hop hornbeam, striped maple, those types of species can get, again, have a competitive advantage and really kind of take over in a forest. So you wind up with fewer species in your forest and just less variety of species and sometimes a loss of some very important species. So now when deer pressure is very high, they will even browse the low preference species. So no plant is really deer resistant. They're maybe the last to go, but if deer are hungry enough, they'll eat just about anything. The species that are preferred by deer also tend to be the ones that are most economically valuable as timber species. Things like oak and maple, and sugar maple is highly preferred by deer, and so that can affect the ability for people to grow maple trees if they want to produce maple syrup, for example. So there are some economic impacts that deer can have when they're heavily browsing a forest. And deer, when they browse seedlings in a forest, that can have a legacy effect on the tree species diversity that lasts for a long, long time. For example, in a study that was conducted in Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, where deer were actually fenced into separate areas at different densities between 1979 and 1990, and then they looked at how that affected tree species diversity. They found that they went back actually and reassessed that tree species diversity as of 2005. So 15 years after deer had been removed from those areas, they looked at what the effects were, the remaining effects were. And what they found was that tree species diversity was lower in areas where the deer density was highest, even 15 years later, which would be something you would expect given that trees are very long-lived, and so those effects would still be felt far, far down the road. In a study conducted at Allegheny National Forest, again, they looked at looking at different deer densities per square mile. They also looked at how that affected the number of wildflower species that were present in the areas. Deer tend to prefer and really feed heavily on some of our native wildflower species as well, things like trillium, pictured on the bottom right, and Canada mayflower, pictured at the lower left, and also species like Indian cucumber, pictured above. And what they found was that as deer density increases, so if you look on the bottom axis there, as you head further and further to the right, you see that as you have more deer, you tend to have fewer wildflower species. Browsing of native plants by deer also allows room for invasive plant species to take over a forest. So, for example, in the picture in the right, you can see a lot of Japanese barberry growing in the understory. In the picture in the left, garlic mustard has kind of taken over. So when deer feed heavily on the understory vegetation and there's no native species there, kind of gives those invasive plants an advantage, and they move in, establish a monoculture, and then that blocks sunlight from reaching seedlings that might grow in the future. So it kind of creates this monoculture and kind of this steady state of a degraded plant community. And this also can cause a forest structure that's favorable for black-legged ticks, especially in the instance of barberry, where studies have found that when you have thick understories of barberry like this, black-legged ticks or the deer tick does better, and so it can have an influence on the prevalence of Lyme disease. Browse-tolerant native plants can also take over, and it may require purposeful management to restore your forest if this happens, even if deer populations are reduced. So say American beech, which is pictured on the left, say American beech is able to establish because deer are browsing the other native species, and beech can kind of take over and form these thickets. That's what's going to be growing in your forest for many, many decades to come, unless something is done to remove that beech and also remove the deer pressure and allow other species to grow. This is also the case when you see a forest with not much understory and a lot of ferns growing on the forest floor, as in the picture to the right. It can be a condition that people view as being very aesthetic and very nice to look at, but it's actually a very disturbed condition. And again, unless those ferns are removed from the forest floor at some point, they can block the sunlight that would be needed by tree seedlings to become established and grow in that forest. So growing a new forest for the future is very difficult under that condition. So how do deer affect other wildlife? Well, they can affect other wildlife in a number of different ways, but the first is that they can change both the habitat structure and composition of that forest. So you see the picture of the forest to the left, where there's not much vegetation except for the forest canopy, not much in the shrub layer or the understory layer, versus the picture on the right, where the forest canopy has been thinned during a timber harvest, and there's sunlight reaching the forest floor, and seedlings were able to reestablish and are growing quite nicely. So that's a picture that shows very nice forest regeneration. And that's very important to wildlife, especially birds, for example. Birds tend to divide the habitat vertically, with some species, like the scarlet tanager, maybe using just the forest canopy, whereas a species like the black-capped chickadee might use the mid-story or understory, and an ovenbird, for example, might use the forest floor vegetation. So it's really important, if you want a diversity of different kinds of birds, you need to have different layers of vegetation, or the birds that are associated with those specific layers will be absent. In that same study at Allegheny National Forest that I showed you earlier, where deer density per square mile affected the number of wildflower species growing, they looked at the number of songbirds observed as well. And the trend was also similar there, where the number of high densities of deer resulted in fewer songbirds being observed. And again, that's in part because of the loss of those different layers of vegetation when deer are very abundant. And they looked in 2008, again, this was about 18 years after the study concluded and the deer were removed from the different areas. They looked at the effects on bird density 18 years later in those areas, and they found that there was a legacy effect, or a long-lasting effect, on the number of birds seen in those forests under different deer densities. And again, in part, that's because of the loss of the different layers of vegetation, and also they found that caterpillar abundance was lower in areas where those layers of vegetation had been removed from deer browsing due to deer browsing in the past, which makes a lot of sense because insects feed on leaves, and so if you don't have a lot of vegetation growing in the understory, there's less food for those insects, and then in turn fewer insects for birds to be able to feed on. In a study in New Jersey, they looked at forest breeding bird species, the trends in their populations from 1980 to 2005. And they found that for the most part, songbirds that use the mid-story or the shrub layer and or nest on the ground are decreasing, whereas those species that are canopy nesters tend to be the species that are increasing or have stable populations in New Jersey. And so some of the species that would be declining would be things that use the ground, like the ovenbird, again pictured at the top left, the rose-breasted grosbeak pictured left center, or the veery pictured in the lower left. Whereas canopy nesters like the tufted titmouse pictured in the upper right, some of our woodpeckers and other species would be declining. Deer can also have a long-lasting effect on their own habitat. When a forest is degraded by over-browsing and suddenly you're missing those lower levels of vegetation where deer can feed and find healthy diversity of different forage species, it can start to affect the quality of food and cover that are available for deer themselves. And so they can have a long-lasting or legacy effect on even the quality of their own habitat. So this is bad for populations and the outlook of on deer numbers and deer health in the future. So what can you do if you have a forest of your own and you're experiencing heavy levels of deer browsing and it's impacting your forest? What can you do? What are your options? And the first thing is to look at what might be the different deer management options. There are a number of different things that you can keep in mind. Fencing can be available to fence some areas of forest, although it can get quite expensive. There are some new fencing methods that are lower cost options. This, of course, is pretty labor intensive to get started, but it can provide good protection while tree seedlings are growing. Once they reach the height of 5 to 6 feet where deer can't reach them anymore, then they're protected and they have the ability to take off and provide the new next forest. You can also protect individual trees using things like tree shelters or tree tubes. So in some instances, in smaller areas, you might be able to get some amount of regeneration going just by protecting individual trees. This also comes at a cost, of course. An important approach to take if you want to reduce the number of deer on your land is to encourage hunting on your property and try to increase the harvest of female deer. So the only way to reduce the deer population is to remove female deer. One way is to encourage hunters on your land to shoot a doe before shooting a buck, so that you're focusing on reducing the number of female deer, or to shoot a doe, focus on shooting does yourself if you hunt that land, you or your family members hunt that land. Deer Management Assistance Program permits are also available for some property owners to be able to distribute to hunters to use on your land alone. So that's something you can consult the New York DEC website to learn more about Deer Management Assistance Program permits and their availability or potential availability for you to use. In addition, it's really important to just spend time out in your forest, kind of taking note of where you are in terms of the health of your forest and the impacts deer are having. You can look for visual signs. So go out and see, are there wildflowers present on your forest floor? Are they flowering? Sometimes species like trillium will be present, but you'll notice that they don't flower very often. And that means that deer are having an impact because as they browse those flowers, it's taking away some vital food reserves that that plant has to be able to put into producing flowers. So sometimes you might see the plants, but they won't be flowering. Also look, are there a variety of different tree seedlings present? Or do you just have, for example, all American beech seedlings growing? Are any of them growing past the height that deer can reach, that level of 5 to 6 feet? And is there evidence of browsing, either direct browsing on seedlings? When you look at your seedlings that are growing, they're nipped off at the top or they're deformed, or looking across your whole forest for signs of a browse line with no vegetation growing under 5 to 6 feet. You can also create your own deer exclosure to be able to look at inside versus outside of an exclosure. And it doesn't have to be large. This small deer exclosure pictured here is only about 12 feet by 12 feet, and you could even make it smaller than that. But this is just a really good way to see, to be able to compare inside and outside and see if deer are having an impact, and if so, how severe is that impact. So for example, this exclosure, the vegetation you see growing there was after about 2 or 3 years. You can see that inside is much different from the outside, even after this short period of time. And so that's an indication that deer are having a pretty serious impact on the vegetation growing in that forest. So by spending time to walk and monitor your forest land, you can really get a good feel for the situation. If you are having a substantial impact, or if you're not, for example, you can just continue to monitor and spend time looking for deer impacts and making sure that nothing's changing in any serious way. If you are seeing substantial impacts, then again, the potential solutions would be to manage the deer herd to try to reduce deer numbers, fence to exclude deer, and even small fences can be beneficial, small exclosures. If you have a situation where there are some serious, long-lasting legacy effects of deer, so for example, you have nothing but ferns on the forest floor, or a stand of barberry where you would expect or hope seedlings to be growing, then you may have to take some action to actually restore your woodland to overcome those legacy effects if you want a good new native forest to be able to regenerate. So some of those actions would be to remove competing vegetation, such as beech brush, ferns, or invasive species. And an important thing to note, too, is that even after you remove them, if you still have the same number of deer, you'll need to fence those areas after you remove the competing vegetation, or the problem will just return because deer will continue to feed on the new plants that start to grow. planting might be necessary in severely degraded habitats with a long history of deer impacts. So say you see these legacy effects in your forest and there are no longer any native overstory trees, or not a variety of native overstory trees that you might like to see in your future forest. In that case, then planting might be your only option to be able to restore some level of diversity to your forest. So success might look something like this, where you have a number of different species growing in your understory, the understory of your forest, and this is the type of condition that you want to shoot for if you want to have healthy forests, healthy deer, and healthy wildlife populations in the future. So thank you very much. I hope that you've learned some tools that can be helpful to you in your forest, and I thank you for joining me.